It started quietly. In early 1977, rock music still sounded like the past. Led Zeppelin was still playing sold-out arenas. Fleetwood Mac had just released Rumors, a polished masterpiece born from personal heartbreak. Pink Floyd was working on Animals, their dark and bitter follow-up to Wish You Were Here. Everything seemed under control. But in the shadows, something was boiling. Across the Atlantic, in grimy clubs in London, angry young bands were tuning their guitars to rage. They had no money, no record deals, and no patience for solos or stadium shows. They didn't want to sound like their parents' rock records. They wanted to burn it all down. That same frustration was growing in New York, too. In a place called CBGB, strange new acts were spitting lyrics like bullets. The Ramones were playing songs that barely lasted 2 minutes. Blondie was mixing pop, punk, and glam. Television was turning chaos into poetry. The walls of tradition were starting to crack. But the mainstream didn't notice. Not yet. Radio was still full of the old guard, the Eagles, Boston, Supertramp. Everything sounded clean, safe, predictable. Nobody expected what was coming. Then, one night in January, a skinny guy with spiky hair and torn clothes shouted 4 words that would change everything. I am an antichrist. Johnny Rotten had arrived. And 1977 would never be the same again. The Sex Pistols didn't want to entertain you. They wanted to offend you. Their debut single Anarchy in the UK had already made the British press panic. But when Nevermind the Bollocks dropped in late October, it was a nuclear bomb. This wasn't just music. It was war. Rotten sneered. Steve Jones' guitar sliced like glass. Sid Vicious thumped his bass like a threat. They mocked the Queen. They mocked the system. They mocked you. And kids loved it. Because finally, someone was saying out loud what they had been screaming inside. Punk wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling. Anger. Energy. Rebellion. And it spread fast. In the UK, The Clash released their debut album just months earlier. Songs like White Riot weren't just about race. They were about fire, frustration, and fighting back. The Damned, Buzzcocks, and X-Ray SPX followed. A whole army of misfits. In the U.S., Patti Smith Horses had opened the door, but now television's Marquee Moon showed what punk could become: beautiful, broken, brilliant. The Ramones were getting louder. Talking Heads were getting weirder. Suddenly, leather jackets, safety pins, and ripped shirts became a uniform. Major labels didn't know what to do, so they either ran away or threw money at the chaos, hoping it would go away. It didn't. And just as punk was exploding, another sound was rising. One nobody expected. It came from the suburbs. It had no guitars, no shouting, just lights, beats, and rhythm. It was disco, and rock had another war to fight. While punk was ripping everything apart, disco was doing something totally different. It was building a world of escape. On the dance floors of New York, clubs like Studio 54 turned into temples of rhythm. The Bee Gees weren't rebels, but they were everywhere. Saturday Night Fever hit cinemas in December 1977, and its soundtrack swallowed the charts. Stayin' Alive wasn't just a song, it was a statement. Disco was dominant. To rock fans, it felt like betrayal. Guitars were out. Drums were mechanical. Everything was polished. Groovy. Happy. It was music for dancing, not thinking. But while punk was underground and angry, disco was rich, shiny, and on every radio. The clash was cultural. Working-class punks hated disco's glitter and glamour. Rock fans saw it as fake. But millions danced anyway. Donna Summer, Chic, Gloria Gaynor. They ruled the airwaves. And rock began to fracture. Some bands, like the Rolling Stones, dipped into disco with tracks like Miss You. Others refused. They doubled down on guitar solos and long songs. But something had changed. The world wasn't listening the same way anymore. Even within rock, there was rebellion against the rebellion. Out of nowhere, in a small town called Pasadena, for kids in spandex were rewriting rock with insane speed and sound. Eddie Van Halen's fingers moved faster than anyone had heard before. His guitar didn't just sing, it screamed. By the end of 1977, disco was climbing. Punk was exploding, and a new form of guitar hero was on the rise. The old order was dying, and rock wasn't going quietly. For years, rock's giants ruled the world. Led Zeppelin was one of the biggest bands on the planet. Every album was a masterpiece. Every tour was a spectacle. But by 1977, the cracks were starting to show. They were on their last U.S. tour that year, and it was cursed. Robert Plant had just lost his young son. Jimmy Page was sinking deeper into heroin. On stage, they were powerful. Offstage, they were ghosts of themselves. Their show in Oakland ended in violence. Their manager was arrested. Their spirit was shattered. It would be the last time they toured America. Across the sea, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors was a massive success. But behind the scenes, it was war. Breakups, affairs, drug use that filled entire studios. They made music about love while tearing each other apart. Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham sang songs of heartbreak to each other while standing just feet apart. Pink Floyd, too, was unraveling. Animals was cold, brutal, and brilliant. But Roger Waters was taking over. The band that once felt like a brotherhood was now a battlefield. Even Elvis Presley, rock's original king, was fading. He played his last concert in June 1977, bloated, tired, and barely holding on. 2 months later, he was gone. The world mourned. But to many young fans, his death felt like a symbol. The old era had ended. The giants were still there, but their shadows were longer than their fire. Meanwhile, a strange new light was starting to glow. Not from London, not from LA, but from a small town in Georgia. A group of oddball college kids calling themselves REM were rehearsing in garages. Nobody knew it yet, but the seeds of a future movement, alternative rock, were quietly taking root. And at the same time, a different kind of revolution was beginning on the streets. A revolution not just of music, but of message. While rock fought for its soul and disco ruled the clubs, something new was happening in the parks of the Bronx. Kids were dragging turntables out on his sidewalks. They weren't playing guitars. They were spinning vinyl, looping beats, chanting rhymes, telling stories over drum breaks. It wasn't rock. It wasn't disco. It was something raw, something real. It was hip-hop. In 1977, the blackout in New York became legend. Looting? Yes. But for many future DJs and MCs, it was the night they got their first turntable. Their first mic, their first shot, Africa Bombata, Grandmaster Flash, DJ Kool Herc. They weren't famous yet, but they were planting the roots of a new sound, one that would change the world just as much as punk had. It was the voice of the street, not polished, not sold, just real. Meanwhile, over in England, reggae was moving from the background to the front lines. The Clash didn't just borrow punk's fury, they stole reggae's groove too. Bob Marley's Exodus dropped in '77 and spoke to a global generation. Songs like One Love and Waiting in Vain gave the world rhythm and revolution. Everywhere, music was crossing wires. Punk was borrowing from reggae. Disco was creeping into rock. Rock stars were wearing makeup. Disco stars were picking up guitars. 1977 wasn't about one genre winning. It was about everything crashing into everything else. It was chaos, and it was beautiful, but there was one more moment that would seal 1977 in history, a moment that would come not from anger, not from rebellion, but from a single, perfect sound that felt like the future. In July 1977, a French band nobody in America had really heard of released a strange, dreamy song. It was called Oxygen, Part 4, by Jean-Michel Jarre. It didn't have vocals. It didn't have guitars. It didn't even have drums in the traditional sense. It was all synthesizers, layered, breathing, glowing like stars. It felt like floating in space, and it quietly opened a door. Electronic music wasn't new. Kraftwerk had been making robot music in Germany for years, but now it was breaking out of the labs and entering living rooms. Synths were no longer science projects. They were becoming instruments of pop. Gary Newman, Ultravox, and later Depeche Mode were taking notes. David Bowie had already moved to Berlin, recording Low and Heroes, albums full of icy synths and haunted silence. Even rock gods were watching, because deep down, they all knew the future wasn't loud guitars. It was something else, something colder, smoother, sharper. The seeds of new wave, synth pop, and techno were all planted in 1977. It was the year rock looked in the mirror and saw something unfamiliar and terrifying. But out of fear came invention. The rules were gone. The map was torn. And the next step? No one knew. By the time 1977 ended, music had changed forever. The giants were no longer gods. Punk had broken the gate. Disco had taken the crown. And new sounds, electronic, hip-hop, post-punk, were already growing in the shadows. But more than anything, 1977 taught one brutal truth. Music doesn't wait for you. It reinvents. It rebels. It refuses to stand still. For some, 1977 was the year their heroes fell. For others, it was the year they found their voice. Some danced. Some screamed. Some turned knobs in silence, chasing sounds no one had heard before. And decades later, we still feel its echo. Every punk anthem, every synth-pop hit, every street rhyme, every indie guitar riff, they all trace back to that one chaotic, beautiful year. Because 1977 wasn't just a year. It was a revolution, and revolutions never really end.